Today, in both the first reading and the Gospel, we are warned in rather stark terms about the danger of failing to forgive, and instead nurturing hatred in our heart. Why is this stressed so aggressively and with such great warning? This is because holding grudges in our hearts is directly contrary to love of neighbor. And indeed, when God first gave the command to love our neighbor in Leviticus, he immediately followed it with a command not to bear a grudge against our neighbor. For what is the love that we are commanded? Well, to love in this sense is to will the good of the other. This is the opposite of failing to forgive. When we bear hatred in our hearts, we will the evil of our neighbor, not his good. And the command to love our neighbor is one of the two great commandments, along with loving our God with all our heart, soul, and mind. Jesus says, upon these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. In other words, the entirety of the moral life is rooted in some way in these two commandments. And while there are many ways in which we can fail to love our neighbor, few are as both direct and as easy as bearing a grudge against them. Because other forms of failing to love our neighbor take work. They take our neighbor being close at hand, and so they're much harder, or they're more indirect. Yes, love of our neighbor would entail that we think about this, and if we're thinking about it, then we should act upon it in this way under these circumstances. But bearing a grudge and hating our neighbor, that is directly contrary to loving him. And on a practical level, other forms of failing to love our neighbor, like, say, slashing the tires of the car that's going 45 in the left lane, that takes work. You have to follow him, and given his pace, that's going to take forever. Then you need to park your car out of his vision, wait for him to leave, then actually build up the courage to slash those tires. That's a whole lot of work to fail to love our neighbor. Whereas imagining ourselves doing this as we're stuck behind him, that's much easier. And yet, both of these are strongly contrary to loving him. Merely letting our minds focus on some grievance or some grudge and failing to forgive, that's quite easy. It can even become habitual. And failing to forgive our neighbor and instead hating him will tend to warp our understanding of this situation. It can make small offenses seem like large ones. And it can cause us to forget the nuances of the situation. Rarely are people acting entirely unreasonably or entirely at fault. But grudges can make us unable to see that. Now, all of these warnings about failing to forgive are not an encouragement to be a silent doormat. Love of neighbor is not incompatible with trying to fix a messed up situation by speaking up, trying to prevent a problem from returning, or even seeking justice through legal means. Our Lord gave civil authorities the sword to execute justice on his behalf. And we can, quite legitimately assist in various ways with that process. But hatred and failing to forgive is not about any of these things. Indeed, because it blinds our minds and poisons our hearts, it makes it harder to resolve these situations, not easier. On a practical level, most of our problems with other people can be most effectively dealt with by calmly talking out the problem in a friendly way and trying to find a solution that everyone can live with. Hatred can make this much harder. And where there is not the feelings of forgiveness, where there's not feelings of love for each other, then any sort of concession feels like weakness rather than working together towards a common end. And indeed, it is precisely with our friends who are most aware of our faults and we of their faults that it is easiest to resolve problems, because where we are bound together by common charity, then it is easiest to resolve problems. Now, how do we deal with this? On a simple level, consciously making the decision to forgive another who has in some way harmed us is where we should start. It's definitely something that we can do and should do. Now, when thoughts come to our mind, addressing that can be a bit more complicated. With other sins, we can more directly turn our backs on them, but for sins of the mind, we can and should try and push these thoughts away. But another approach is to take these thoughts coming into our mind as an opportunity to pray for the other person. Christ commands us to pray for those who persecute us. And what he commands for those who harm us in a very unjust way, to a large extent, we should similarly do for those who, in some relatively light way, have harmed us. Or even in the most significant ways, we should still pray for them. Praying for them trains us to will their good. It turns what is an occasion of sin into an occasion not merely to avoid sin, but to instead directly turn our wills against this weakness and to direct them to our neighbor's good. At first, this is a challenge, but as we continue to react to these sorts of thoughts coming to our mind, then it becomes much easier and even habitual. And once this is a habit, then it is much easier to live out forgiveness in our hearts. I have found this approach very helpful. It is an area where, through reflecting upon the advice of Christ and the advice of my spiritual director, I was able to make substantial progress. And was it a challenge at first? Yes. But once I did it for a few months, it became almost habitual and quite easy. And so, I would suggest, if any of you are struggling with forgiveness or bearing a grudge, to commit to praying at least once a day for the person you are struggling to forgive, and then whenever these thoughts come to mind,